Hi, I'm Yorley Huff, and I'm here to take you on a journey of my life. To share this journey with you today is such an honor and a privilege. I am a product of the west side of Chicago in K Town. I was raised by my grandparents, and we have a three flat family building on Tripp and Roosevelt Road. I remember times with my grandparents being there. My granddad was a minister, my grandmother was a first lady. And although she was the first lady of the church, she was hellfire at home. She was also the woman who delivered me when my mother went into labor, as I'm told. And I was born in the coal, which is the medical term for being born in the amniotic sac. My grandmother, after delivering me, had to burst this amniotic sac, spewing fluids everywhere, which she talked about often taking 3 weeks to get it off of her skin. Additionally, finally, when the ambulance came, they said that I was crying. I was singing, not crying. And down south in Mississippi, where my grandparents are from, this was called being born with a veil over my face. And all of this will have great significance as we get along in the story. My grandparents were second generation from slavery and left the South under the threat of a white man, an altercation my granddad had with a white man. They ended up coming up from the South and finding their place on the west side of Chicago and having four children. One of the children got hit by a car and passed away as a young child. My mother was the oldest of the four and the only girl. And as we talk about life and the things that happen, we often refer to generational curses. My mother, in the process of having other relatives come up from the South, migrating from the South, ended up being molested by a cousin who stayed with my grandparents. And my grandmother was born to a single mom and ended up staying with this cousin's mother, which would be my grandmother's aunt, which she really was rebellious against and didn't like her very much. So there was bad blood to begin with. So when this incident happened with my cousin molesting my mother, my grandmother did not address it. She felt as though she had a grudge against the aunt that she didn't like that raised her. So my mother's issues never got addressed, and they began to grow and manifest into other things because it wasn't addressed. My mother ended up marrying my father, and this was the only way that she felt that she could get away from my grandparents was to get married. They ended up living in the family building on the second floor. And as it was told to me that at one point in time, they painted all the walls black in the apartment. And no one thought that that was strange or question it. I was also told that as a child, they would give me cold duck to see me dance. And as the story goes, I unfortunately don't remember much of early childhood. My memories start to um, kick in maybe about the age from 8 9, 10 years old. And later in life, I found out that I was could have been molested by my natural father, and then ended up being molested by a family member, my cousin, young, and then molested again by my stepfather. And that was around the age of 10 or 11. So we lived on and off with my grandparents and my mother. And one time I can remember living with my father. My father ended up being in and out of the picture. I grew up in a home. My granddad worked 3 jobs. He was a pastor, he was a barber, and he worked for the post office operating the elevator. And my granddad provided everything that he could. My grandmother, I don't remember her working, but at times I was told that she would get jobs in like a retail store off and on. And her job was to take care of the home and cook and clean. And she was an excellent cook. So growing up in K Town on the west side of Chicago, it was in the midst of gangs, drugs, prostitution. And fortunately, we had families at that time. So on our block, there were households and buildings, multi units that entire families lived in, and we know, noted those homes and multi units by the family name: the Crosses, the Turners, the Hudsons, so on and so forth. But I can just remember that no one ever bothered the Hudsons. That was my family. For whatever reason, I never knew, but I knew that the social ills was surrounding us, but never directly affecting us. My family was a military family. My granddad was the first black military police in his infantry. My mother ended up working for the Cook County Jail for a number of years and also working for the Department of Health. And my mother always worked just like my granddad. So it was really never any family time with my mom. She was always working. So growing up, my grandparents believed that children should be heard and not should be seen and not heard. And it was a situation where family was there but not supportive. I can remember hearing frequently what I wasn't going to be. What I was going to be wasn't all of that positive. I was going to be a prostitute. I was going to be a mother of many children, a whore, so on and so forth. And I just remember feeling not supported. I had low self esteem, and the only thing I can tell you is that God intervened early because I began to what I now know as affirmations and visualizations to lift myself up, to encourage myself daily. And I made sure that I did my homework. I got good grades. And when I got into high school, I was in sports on the track team. And my granddad would always drop me off and pick me up. And they came to some of my track meets. My grandparents did. My mother never came. My brother was older. I have an older brother and a younger sister. My brother was older. It was just my brother and myself at the time. And when he graduated and went to college, he ended up going to the Army. So he was gone pretty much since I was a preteen. And so being in this family building, living amongst my uncles and my grandparents. It was torturous at times. My uncle used to, we used to live on the third floor with my grandparents. One of my uncles lived on the second floor, and one of my other uncles lived on the first floor. And we had a deep freezer. My grandmother had a deep freezer on the second floor. And for some reason, they never really had the hallway lights on. And always in darkness, my grandmother would always send me downstairs to get stuff out of the deep freezer. And for some reason, my uncle thought it was funny to scare me in the midst of going to the second floor, up to the third floor in the dark. And would you jump out and just scare the hell out of me? And it was torturous as a young kid. I was also made to clean up after all of the adults. It was heinous. I used to have to clean the bathroom, and for some reason, they never had a toilet brush beyond my thinking. So I had to clean the toilet with my hand. And especially when Aunt Chick, which is like a sister, was like a sister to my grandmother, would come up from Mississippi, and I would have to psych myself out to put my bare hands in this toilet and clean all of the feces and urine that all of these adults had been using the bathroom from with no toilet brush. And the bathroom would be spotless. And my granddad would always say, "You're the best bathroom cleaner that I know." Not realizing how damaging that could be to a child to have to do that behind adults. And I always used to have to wash the dishes. Everybody, my grandmother would cook for the whole building. She would cook elaborate, enormous amounts of food. And everybody would come and eat, but nobody would wash the dishes, so I would have to wash the dishes. So it was a task to see like nobody cleaning up behind themselves, and I would have to do that. Um, I then graduated high school at 17, and I really, at this point, wanted to get away from my family, as far away from them as I could. I was trying to go to University of Alaska, Texas, anywhere but here. At this point, it was really, I've always felt that I was from another planet just because of my beliefs and how I operated. My family um, oftentimes would be in attempts to shut me down or try to control my thinking. I guess I was an out of the box thinker as a child and very determined and very creative. And that was against the norm in my family for some reason. So I'm still the black sheep of the family, let's just put it that way. So after my grandparents taking care of me and my brother, my mother had my sister. I was 11 when she came along, and my grandparents were getting older, and my grandparents were trying to help my mom with my sister, and my grandmother ended up becoming ill, and she ended up having to have open heart surgery. And then I had been to college for a semester at Texas Southern University, and I came home and I got my own place, and I still went to junior colleges and different colleges to finish my degree. And I just noticed as my grandparents aged that they needed help. And my grandparents were the kind of grandparents I could spend my rent money and go to them and they would give me my rent money, no questions asked. And one day I said to myself, like, really, you can't live like this. You can't um you can't depend on them. You can't be a taker. They've given you so much. And as I started to work, I began to give to them and to take care of them and help my granddad with my grandmother. And I can remember coming, just dropping by one day, and he had been to the doctor with my grandmother. And he was sitting on the porch so frustrated because he couldn't get her up the stairs. She couldn't walk. And they still remained on the third floor and nobody was around. And I just couldn't put all this together. Like, these are your parents. How can you not see that they needed help? So I ended up having to carry my grandmother up 3 flights of stairs to get her upstairs. I told my granddad, don't worry, everything will be okay. And he was just like, okay. And so from that day forward, I just made sure that whatever I stopped asking them for um, support, and I started supporting them in every way that I could for doctor's appointments, cleaning up, making sure my grandmother and my granddad had food and the medicine that she needed. And whenever, even changing the sheets on her bed, she was bedridden, and it was difficult for my granddad because he had worked 3 jobs for forever, and now having to have my grandmother in that domestic role, he didn't have a clue on what needed to be done and how to support my grandmother and how to take care of her. So I would come over just almost daily and call regularly and continue to call and support them. And one day I was calling and calling and calling. I couldn't get through. Nobody was answering the phone. And I just was like, I better go over there. And when I got there, the third floor had the windows were busted out. They were, it was just open. It had been a fire, and nobody called me and told me anything. So I found out that my grandmother was in the hospital and that she had third and fourth degree burns, that my uncle was there with his children on the first floor, but he had been drugged out and drinking, and the neighbors saw the flames and they were trying to get in, but he wouldn't wake up. And they ended up cutting a hole in the roof and found my grandmother at the door. She had crawled out of the bed to try to get away from the flames, and they found her at the front door. And so she was in the hospital, and I had to find out where she was. And getting to the hospital, she was just swollen like 2 or 3 times her size. And my granddad was there, and he was devastated. They lost everything from the time that they had moved there from Mississippi until that day. And I would see my uncles there, and my granddad was there every day. So he ended up at my cousin's house after staying with one of his sons. And he didn't have anything, not even underwear. They lost everything. And I can remember going to the hospital, and my uncles and everybody's just talking And the doctor comes in and he says, well, my grandmother's doing really well. And they're thinking about releasing her, but they need an address to release her to. And they wanted to know. And the response that they gave the doctor was like, we have to have a meeting. And I really was like, what do you mean you have to have a meeting? He's saying that she's going to get released. And you're you want to have a meeting? It was just shocking. So I left and I began to find a place for my grandparents to stay. I had a studio apartment, so I broke my lease where I was. I found another apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment, one where my grandparents can stay, where my grandmother could get released to. And we moved. And it was, I didn't even pay attention to the backlash or whatever was said. I just knew that my grandmother needed a place to stay. My granddad needed a place to stay. They needed somewhere to regroup, to start gaining back what they had lost. And ever since then, um, I got the unit. My grandmother had one room, my granddad had another room, and I slept on the floor. And by this time, I was just entering the police academy. So